Hi, this is Bobby Samuelson. I'm the president of Life Innovators. We are an independent life insurance and annuity product development company. And today I'm going to cover the concept of a fixed index linked annuity, also known as a FILA, in 2 minutes or less. So, what is a FILA? High level, FILA is a new variation on an FIA product that attempts to bridge the gap between an FIA and a RILA without crossing over the line into a registered product. So this is a fixed product that has some RILA-like attributes. And in a lot of ways, we view this as the next generation of FIA. So this is a FILA can do all the things an FIA can do and more. And that's really the power of the chassis. I'm reminded of back in 2009 when I went to an AT&T store to buy a new phone. And I remember the salesperson handing me the latest BlackBerry and handing me an iPhone and saying, well, here's the deal. The BlackBerry has the physical keyboard. Everybody loves the physical keyboard. They love the fact that this is a phone really designed to do work email really well. But we have this newfangled thing called an iPhone. Doesn't have the physical keyboard. That's the big downside. But it can also do work email, and it can do a lot more than that. Which one do you want? And I remember holding the two phones in my hands and looking at them, and eventually, obviously, going with the iPhone. And the reason why was because it's a both and solution. And in a lot of ways, that's the FILA concept. It's a both and solution. It can do what an FIA can do, and it can do more. And that is the power of the concept. However, with any new concept, there's obviously a fair bit of a learning curve. And that is certainly the case here with FILA. I think there's a perception in the marketplace that it is more complex than it actually is. Our argument would be that it's not. This really is operates almost identically to an FIA with just a couple of little twists and a couple of new words to learn. And so really the goal of today's video is to go through a FILA in 2 minutes or less. And so the way we're going to do that is we're going to do 2-minute chunks. So the first 2 minutes will be the basics of the product. You could stop after this 2 minutes and a client would understand really everything they would need to know about how they experience a FILA product. Not every nook and cranny, not every possible nuance or mechanical quirk about the product, but in terms of how the client actually experiences the ownership of the product, I'm going to show you that you can do that in 2 minutes or less with no visuals. Just 5 things to keep in mind, which 2 of which, by the way, are shared by FIA. The next 2 minutes will be focused on the actual crediting methodology. So this is a more detailed view of how it works, introduce some of the new terminology that you'll see in a FILA contract. Again, I would argue it's not more complicated than what takes 2 minutes to explain. And then the last piece is what happens when you start executing transactions with a FILA, for example, free withdrawals, full surrenders, death benefits. How does a FILA treat those types of transactions? Because that's where it is a little bit different than an FIA. But again, I would argue more in common than different. So that's the goal today. Give you 3 2-minute stories, 6 minutes total of content. If you can get through all 6 minutes with a client or a prospect or whoever, I would argue that they understand 99% of what they need to know about FILA as a product category. And then after that, what we'll do is kind of cruise through a couple of little visuals to hone in some of the, or to really put a point on some of the other content we've covered, and then get to the 2 FILAs in marketplace today and show you some of the differences between those 2. So that's the goal for today. But again, the main thing is 2 minutes or less. How do you explain FILA? Let's give it a shot. All right, so let's start with the basics. What are the 5 things you need to know and be able to explain? And I'm going to do it in 2 minutes for a client to understand or an advisor to understand FILA. First thing is principal protection. This is a completely principal protected product, just like an FIA. This product also has upside potential linked to the performance of an external index, just like an FIA. And the upside potential is limited by some level of non-guaranteed declared participation, whether it's in the form of a cap or a participation rate or a spread, just like any other FIA, and indexed performance adjusted by the participation, so the cap, spread, par, whatever, is applied on an annual basis, just like an FIA. So these 2 things are exactly the same as an FIA. And so that brings home the first point, which is if you want a FILA to work exactly like an FIA, it can. But it can also do more. What else can it do? Well, unlike a traditional FIA, FILA offers a range of strategies with exposure to index downside in exchange for significantly greater indexed upside potential. However, we can never violate principles. We can never put principle at risk. So how then do we offer downside without exposing principal to loss? Well, we restrict the ability to elect the allocations with downside risk only to policies with sufficient indexed gains. You can never risk more than what you've previously accrued in gains. And so literally the way this works is as you have gains, those gains give you access to strategies with greater downside risk, whatever the carrier makes available. And then the client ultimately gets to choose how much risk they take. They can either select a 0% floor, the policy will perform exactly like an FIA, or they can use that to lock in their gains, or they can unlock their gains and have it and pick a strategy that has downside risk with greater upside potential. And that's it in 1 minute and 59 seconds. 5 things to know: principal protection with indexed upside, same as an FIA. The difference is downside risk options, the fact that you have to earn access to those downside risk options by having gains inside the contract. And ultimately, the client is in control. They can make it look just like an FIA if they want to. That's a FILA. That's really all there is to it. And if you just stopped right there, that would encapsulate the experience for clients as they actually own a FILA product. Is it complicated? Not really. It's the exact same mechanics as a traditional FIA, except for the fact that we offer downside risk strategies, but we restrict access to the strategies based on the policy gains. And again, the client's in control, just like an FIA. They can choose whatever account they want, whatever risk level they want from whatever strategies are made available to them. So that's 2 minutes. Again, if you get through that, I would argue that will fully cover the experience that most clients have with this product. Now, I know for a lot of technicians, they say, well, I want to know more and I want to be able to explain more. So let's dig a little bit deeper and say, okay, how does a FILA actually work and execute on delivering these 5 things? And that has to do with crediting. So I'm going to take 2 minutes and explain how the crediting mechanism really works inside of a FILA. So it starts with a long-dated crediting strategy. So this is for example, a 10-year crediting strategy. And the moment that you allocate money into the crediting strategy, you obviously have an account value, just like normal. And that account value stays constant throughout the 10 years until it receives the final index credit. And so how do we determine that final index credit? Well, we start tracking another value, which we're going to call here a tracking value. And on day 1, that's equal to the premium that's been allocated to the strategy. And that tracking value mechanically works exactly like an account value. Every year, it earns annual index adjustments. So the index goes up subject to the cap, par rate, or spread. There will be an adjustment, and that will be applied to the tracking value. Those adjustments can be positive or negative. And as I've already discussed, strategies with the possibility for negative adjustments are restricted to contracts where the tracking value already has gains that have built up inside of it. And then at the end of the term, at the end of 10 years, if there are gains in the tracking value, those gains are credited to the account value. And so at the end of the term, the account value is equal to the tracking value. The final index credit is equal to the gains in the tracking value, which therefore brings the account value up to the tracking value. Now, 10-year crediting strategy sounds a little bit scary. So let me take away one of the key objections here, which is, gosh, 10 years seems like a long time to wait. It does, of course. So insurance companies can, at their discretion, build contracts that allow for liquidity in the tracking value. So for example, if the client were to take a partial withdrawal, some or all of that tracking value might actually be available for the partial withdrawal. Same goes for a full surrender. Same goes for a death benefit. So you really don't have to wait the 10 years to get the benefits of the growth in the tracking value, depending on how the contract is structured. That again is 1 minute and 59 seconds on how the crediting mechanism inside of FILA works. Again, I would argue it's really not that complicated. If you boil it down, it is a long-dated crediting strategy that grows a tracking value with annual index adjustments that work exactly the same way as index credits do for account value. But here we're making adjustments to a tracking value. The final index credit is equal to the gains in the tracking value over the 10 years. And the company can give you access along the way to the tracking value for free withdrawals, full surrender, and or a death benefit. That's how crediting works. That's the most technical, most complex part of this product right there. And I would argue, again, not that different than a typical FIA. All the mechanics are basically the same, except we're embedding them inside of a long-dated crediting strategy. All right, now for the final 2 minutes, let's talk about liquidity. Let's talk about transactions. When a client actually goes to take a free withdrawal, there is a death, do a full surrender. How's that going to work? So 2 minutes on that. If you want to use, if the values need to be liquid prior to the end of the term, first thing you need to know is this contract, unlike a typical FIA, has daily values. FIAs are typically kind of annual values. Charges may come out monthly, but usually it's annual values. You reference the previous policy anniversary until you get the next credit. Here, because we have the potential for negative index adjustments, we have to have daily values. So that means that when you take the withdrawal, when you do the full surrender, really matters because the values are changing daily. It also means that because this is a long dated crediting strategy, not all of the gains are available if the client, for example, does a full withdrawal. So the idea might be that instead of having 100% of the gains in the tracking value available, there might be 95% or 97% or 99%. For most clients taking, for example, a free withdrawal, that is less than if you put $100,000 on the policy, less than $100 would be essentially unvested gains that you would not be able to access for a free withdrawal, for an example. However, every client policy can be set up differently. Every carrier can set this up differently. So the vesting schedule may change by carrier. Some carriers might not even use a vesting schedule to keep for the gains. So it really depends on the contract. Typically for death benefit, what we've seen so far is that carriers give the client the full tracking value on death, the greater of the daily value as it stands or the previous anniversary tracking value. Typically for full surrender, you get the tracking value adjusted by the vesting schedule, which again is going to be 99% or greater of the full tracking value. And then for the partial withdrawals, vesting schedule applies there as well. Again, 99% plus of the partial withdrawal that you would get if it was just pure tracking value. That vesting schedule really is not a lot of money. And so again, less than 2 minutes, that's how you explain liquidity. Daily values and vesting schedule are really the only change. Other than that, everything works as normal off of a tracking value. It's just not that complicated. So breaking all this down, again, 2-minute chunks on the basics, crediting, liquidity. If we kind of tie it all up together, I'll just give a really brief high-level overview of how this logic flows, and I think it'll make perfect sense to you. So again, we have principal protection with index upside, just like an FIA. The difference is that a FILA offers the potential to have strategies with downside risk and greater upside potential. But because we can't put principal at risk, we restrict the access to those strategies for allocation only to policies that have sufficient gains. The more gains you get, the greater access you have to strategies with more downside risk and greater upside potential. But the choice of whether or not to actually take the risk to get more upside potential is completely in the hands of the client. The client always has total control over whether or not they are taking risk. If they want to take risk off the table and select the 0% floor, they can absolutely do that. Now, how do we do that while keeping this inside of an FIA chassis? Well, we use a long-dated crediting strategy. And instead of crediting negative and positive credits to the account value, we use a tracking value. Works exactly the same way as an account value. And instead of calling them credits, we call them adjustments. Over the 10 years, that tracking value has gains. Those gains eventually create the final index credit at the end of the 10 years, but you don't have to wait the 10 years to get the benefit. The tracking value can be liquid for certain types of transactions, depending on the policy, depending on the carrier and how they design it. How is it liquid? Well, we have daily values. So every day is going to change because we have downside risk here. So we need to recognize daily movements in the index and how they would translate into the into the policy. We'd use a vesting schedule because this is a long dated crediting strategy. Maybe not all the gains are fully vested. Maybe you're going to get 95%, 99% of the gains in the tracking value, if not 100%. And when you look at death benefit, full surrender, and partial withdrawals, the carrier may use the same formula for all three or a slightly different formula for those. But again, only on transaction would you see that. It doesn't affect the actual mechanics of the product. Maybe I've been doing this too long, but it just doesn't seem that complicated. And hopefully these 2-minute chunks help tie together the story. And I would argue these things that you're seeing right here on screen are 99.95% of what you need to know if you were the most technical person explaining it to the most technical client how a FILA works, probably in greater detail than anyone in the last few years has explained an FIA product. But if you really wanted to go there, and you did these 15 things on this slide right here to explain it, you would cover 99.9% of it. All right, now a couple of quick visualizations of this just so you can see everything I'm talking about. I built these to really kind of help explain the story in visual terms. You allocate premium to the FILA crediting strategy. The account value remains constant throughout the 10-year term. Principal always remains protected. When you allocate the premium, you have an account value, you have an equal amount of a tracking value on day one. The tracking value is what receives index-linked adjustments, both positive and negative, on an annual basis. And the mechanics work exactly the same as a traditional FIA. So 1 year point-to-points, 2 year point-to-points, monthly sums, monthly averages, cap spreads, pars, S&P, other indexes, whatever. None of that matters. It all works exactly the same way as it does in an FIA. The only difference is here we're applying it as an adjustment to a tracking value rather than a credit to the account value. As that tracking value grows and has gains, we get access to strategies with downside risk and greater upside potential. And as you roll the clock forward, you have some ups, you have some downs. Again, the client's in control of how much risk they take. Here we show them staying in the strategies with more downside risk and greater upside potential. But at the end of the term, the gains in the tracking value, which are always 0 or greater, right? We can never let you pierce into principal. The gains equal the final index credit at the end of 10 years. And again, the liquidity along the way is up to the contract on how they do it. Numerical example here, again, starting from scratch, $100,000 in the account value, $100,000 in the tracking value, no gains to put at risk. Therefore, we start off in the 0% floor. We have a year where we have a positive credit, $3,500. Now our maximum loss is 3.38%. So the gain is 3.5%, but the maximum loss, the negative credit that could be, or that would be applied to, or the loss that would be applied to the 103,500 and take it back to 100,000 is 3.38. The maximum loss, the gains at risk, is 3.38. That allows us access to the negative 2.5% floor. If we had $110,000, that would give us a 9.17% amount at risk. That allows us access to the negative 7.5% floor. If we have 120,000, that's 16.67. That allows us access to the negative 10%, or if the product were offered a negative 15% floor, we'd have access to that as well. Let's say the client allocated to that actually did have a loss of negative 10%. That takes them back down to 108. And now they can only have access to the negative 5% floor. So I just use this example as a way to show that the availability of the accounts really does vary by the gains inside the contract. We will never let you have access to an account or let the client have access to an account where if they elected it and had a full loss down to the floor, it would pierce their principal. And again, that's how we make this a fixed insurance product. That's how over 10 years we provide the 0% floor like any other FIA. And that's how we protect principal. So that's how the product works. Now, what products are in market? Well, there are 2 FILA products currently in market. There's F&G Dynamic Accumulator 10 and American Equity Flex Shield 10. Let me kind of go through the differences of those so you can see how they play out. Surrender charges here. The question is, what are the surrender charges applied to? Well, with the typical FIA, we know exactly what they're applied to. They're applied to the account value. Here, the surrender charge is applied to the account value in the case of Flex Shield 10, but is applied to the what they call the strategy vesting value in Dynamic Accumulator, which is basically, in our parlance today, the tracking value after the vesting schedule has been applied. So almost the same as the tracking value. So surrender charges are a little bit steeper on Dynamic Accumulator than Flex Shield. Free withdrawal, both products offer 10% free withdrawals, but the amount available for the free withdrawal is the strategy vesting value versus basically just the account value in American Equity. So liquidity is richer on Dynamic Accumulator for free withdrawals. Index options, S&P 500 only for Dynamic Accumulator, S&P 500 plus for volatility controlled indexes for American Equity. Upside participation, cap and par rates for both. Downside floor options, both of them have 0, negative 2.5, negative 5, negative 10, all on 1 year chassis, by the way. They're both all 1 year strategies within 10-year strategy, obviously. Downside floor options for the American Equity product, 0, negative 2.5, negative 5, negative 10, and negative 15. Negative 15 really doesn't matter much for the volatility controlled indexes, but for S&P, it makes a bit of a difference. The ability to spread the allocation. So if you allocate to the strategy and then you want to spread your allocation across several different index options, you can't do that in F&G. You have to go 100% into either S&P cap or S&P par. With Flex Shield, you can spread it across the S&P and the 4 volatility controlled indexes and actually a fixed strategy within the greater, what they call the performance strategy, which is kind of cool. But if you look at the initial upfront rates, because F&G is more S&P focused, we have a 4.25% cap for F&G, and we have a 3.5%. Actually, I think that's 3.25% for American Equity. So Clearly, F&G is more S&P focused, better rates for the S&P, at least initially for the 0% floor. Clearly, American Equity is more focused on the volatility controlled indexes. And actually, if you look at the rate sheet, the negative floor strategies are more attractive for American Equity than they are for F&G. So the cool thing is we're already seeing some clear differentiation between FILA products. There's only 2 in the marketplace, but obviously they're doing slightly different surrender charge applications, slightly different liquidity provisions for free withdrawals. One uses account value, one uses vesting value, different downside floor options. I'm sure we'll see more of those, different ability to allocate across different strategies, different indexed options, and obviously different rates for different strategies. So we're really excited about this space. Again, we really do view this as the next generation of FIA. We have every expectation that more FILA products will enter the space. And again, I would go back to the original analogy I shared earlier as to why that's the case. You know, it took a little bit of time for people to get their hands around the iPhone and figure out the power of that platform. But now it is the dominant phone in the US. BlackBerry recently even pulled their support for their old physical email products because people just flat out don't use them anymore. Our argument is the same thing's going to happen in the FIA space. FILA can do everything that an FIA can do and then some. The cost for having this incredibly powerful new tool is not in the rates. FILA should offer the same rates as an FIA. The cost is simply the learning curve for understanding a little bit of new terminology, a little bit of new mechanics, and a couple of the key pieces for how this thing works. But besides that, it is an FIA and then some. It is the next generation of FIA. That's truly what we believe. And we believe this product category will continue to grow. More and more companies will get into it. And given that the cost of selling FIA is of selling FILA is understanding it well enough to do so, you've already come a long way today, even if you've sat through this video and understanding this product. So I appreciate your time to hear more about FILA. And we have a lot of resources on our website. We have 6 white papers you can read that go into great depth on FILA if you really want to know more. So thanks for your time.